What is going on, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome back to another edition of the Jays for Days podcast. I'm Josh. He's Josh. We got Jay's Jumpers, Jaron Jackson Jr.'s, John Morant's, Joe Johnson's, Jaw Raps, of course. We've got Jays. We got him for days. Josh, how you doing?
I've come to the conclusion after this weekend, I am ready for some other sports to begin in meaningful ways. There was so much important soccer. As much as I love soccer, sometimes I just want to mix it up. So I'm looking forward to the beginning of football and basketball season here.
Nice. Yeah, I don't watch a single second of soccer, but I do have that. I do have the same emotion about golf, and that ends next week. Important golf, 6 days from now. Important golf will be over for at least until the Ryder Cup, and then there will be 1 week of important golf there, and then really we'll go until January 1st without super important golf, and I'm looking forward to it. So I can appreciate the fatigue when it comes to focusing on one sport basically throughout the entire summer, because everything else comes to an absolute screeching halt.
Yeah, it's all about balance.
Indeed. In theory, basketball is going to come around at some point. It is only August 21st, so I hesitate to get too excited.
Yeah, I got to get through the start of the NFL and college football first.
But at least we are close enough to the college basketball season that we can do previews of the college basketball season, and we are indeed doing so today, as we have the last 2 weeks. If you missed the first 2 preview pods, we did the ACC a couple weeks ago, and then the Big East last week. Both of those pods are on our podcast feed as well as our YouTube channel. Just type in Jays for Days Pod in the YouTube search bar, and you should find it there. This week, we tend to go in. We go with Big East first, and then we go in chronological order. Numerical order, right? Chronological is the alphabet. No, that's alphabetical order. Chronological is just time.
Time, yeah.
Okay. Well, we're going in numerical order, which means that
chronological and alphabetical. We'll just say all 3.
We're going in numerical order based on the description of the conference, not the number of teams in the actual conference.
Because if we did it that way,
because if we did it that way, we'd actually do the Big 12 first, which actually it has fewer teams than 12, and the Big 10, which now has, I believe, 724 college basketball teams. I think that's right. Right? In their conference, I think they've added a couple, right, from the West Coast, and now there's like 724 college basketball teams.
Well, and then the next question is, okay, so when are you actually using... At what point are you evaluating, right? Because the Big 12 move is starting this year, but it's not going to be a completely new version until next year, which is also when Texas and Oklahoma leave, and the Big 10 adds the West Coast schools. It's
I've literally like if you asked me to list the teams in the Big 12 right this second, I couldn't do it. Like I'm not joking. I couldn't tell you which teams will play in the Big 12 this year with absolute certainty. I couldn't tell you.
Interesting preview next week.
Yeah. I mean, we'll just have to play a game to see if we both know which teams are in the Big 12 next year. We'll just have to play a game to see if we know. I think it's debatable. Anyways, Big 10 this week, 2023-24 college basketball preview series. We break it down as follows. 5 different categories to try and talk about as much of the conference as possible. Team you're most excited for, the team you're most intrigued by, storylines, teams that could make the NCAA tournament, and a winner of the conference, starting at the top where we normally do. Josh, which team are you most excited for?
Michigan State Spartans.
I think this has to be the answer.
I thought you might go with somebody else who I'm sure we'll talk about later. But to me, it has to be one of those 2 teams. Just out of a how good is this team going to be? I mean, you're bringing back 8 meaningful returners plus this loaded recruiting class led by Xavier Booker. Okay, you lost Joey Hauser. Joey Hauser is just an important piece, but Joey Hauser isn't the face of your program, or you know, you can he is replaceable. Pierre Brooks is the other guy who barely played and is, headed to the Big East and to Butler for theoretically an opportunity to play a bigger role that he didn't get at Michigan State. So that's not a huge loss.
I'm not totally sure he's going to play a bigger role at Butler either. He's
And
been
we'll
pretty
have to
mid this off season.
and we'll have to see how that goes. But that was probably at least the thought process, right? So you don't have it's not like you have to replace all that much. The core of last year's team is still there. You've got an injection of talent. And really what excites me is that I just don't feel like there are many teams that have this much, even if you don't feel great about Michigan State's overall season last year, right? They were not a fantastic team from start to finish, but this many pieces coming back, plus that kind of injection of talent. This is the kind of thing we usually talk about Kentucky sometimes, right?
And
If
Duke
some of the
this year as well.
yes, and Duke is the other team, right? Right. You get a couple 5-star guys that it just doesn't click perfectly the first year, so they come back. Then you bring in the next group, right? Exactly. You don't usually talk about this kind of thing with Michigan State, so that's what I'm. Just, I feel like this is a very, I don't want to say low floor, because I do feel like they're gonna be really good just because last year's team was pretty good, but I do feel like the floor is still relatively low for a team that has this high of a ceiling. I guess I'll put it that way.
Do you remember when we were talking about Duke and I said I really like how Duke's incoming talent and returning productivity doesn't overlap all that much, that it doesn't feel like we're redundant at positions?
Yeah.
I don't feel that way about Michigan State. I think there's redundancy here with 2 of their 3 kind of headline recruits, right? Xavier Booker's going to come in and, his main, like, there's space in the front court for him to operate. There's not a incredibly developed and established front court in East Lansing. That you can't say that about the backcourt, right? Everybody that is coming back. I mean, you've got your 4 of your top 5 scorers. The one that's not coming back is Joey Hauser. Tyson Walker back, 14.8 points. AJ Hogard back, 13.6 assists. That might be the most shocking stat I've seen of the college basketball preview. I was like, AJ Hogard averaged 6 assists per game last year.
Yep.
And right, you've got Malik Hall, Jaden Akins. There's some redundancy here. Whether it's like Xavier Booker, not necessarily, not nearly as much, but Jeremy Fears is not a shooting guard. Jeremy Fears is a true point guard, which I love. You don't get a lot of top 40 recruits that come in with the skill set and the kind of the tools and profile that Jeremy Fears is coming to Michigan State with this year. But Tyson Walker is your point guard, and if Jeremy Fears is, I'm not totally sure I can come up with a way in which Jeremy Fears being better than Tyson Walker is actually a good thing for this basketball team this year, unless he's just one of the 5 best players in the country, which I don't expect to be the case. Cohen Carr is uber athletic, but he has a very raw potential. He's like the cream. He's like the epitome of this guy is uber athletic, and we're betting on him to develop his skills as a basketball player under high level guidance, right? And he's 6'8", I think, 6'7", but he 6'7", 6'8", kind of that like Malik Hall area. So I'm absolutely excited about Michigan State, because I think you're right. They have that combination, that really sexy combination of incoming talent and returning productivity. I I'm just curious how if the sum of the basketball parts is greater or less than the whole when it comes to what they actually put on the floor this season. But they're going to be a super fun and definitely on the short list of teams that I'm most excited for when it comes to this season.
The one thing I would say to your point is Tyson Walker shoots the ball well enough that, I mean, AJ Hogarth averaged 6 assists last season, right? They kind of share point guard duties, even though from a size, build, kind of logical standpoint, Tyson Walker is a point guard.
Mm-hmm.
He shoots the ball well enough that he can play off the ball. So I guess you could make the case that I would almost argue neither he or Hogarth are true natural point guards. They can both play point guard and they both give you different things from the point guard position. But they're kind of a combo in and of themselves. So adding Jeremy Fears to that mix, you could say that you can just play 2 out of the 3 of them, and it doesn't really matter which. Hogarth and Walker don't have specifically defined roles where they have to be at the point guard position, or they have to be at the shooting guard position. That's the one thing I would say. But you're absolutely right and that's not even including Jaden Akins, who's also kind of in that. Now he's not going to handle the ball very much, but another guard to factor into this.
Mm-hmm.
But you are right that the best part of this team last season was the backcourt, and now you have an exciting guy, Jeremy Fears, who, right, if he's playing an incredible amount of minutes, that probably means something went wrong, or you're a very small basketball team.
Right.
So that's an interesting dynamic. The other thing I'll say, this team didn't make twos get to the free throw line or force turnovers last season. If you're looking for areas where they need to be better to realize their potential, those are the 3 I would look at. They shot the ball incredibly well from 3.
Mm-hmm.
But they were a very 3 reliant team in the sense that, once they got inside the arc, it didn't go so well and they didn't get to the free throw line very much. So there you go.
Yeah, I don't think Michigan State was any good last year. So that's the other part of this is and we'll get to Purdue, but like you want Purdue's backcourt to take a step forward, but they don't have to. Zach Edey's the best player in the country, and literally nobody can stop him. And there was another team, I can't remember who it was, and maybe it was another team in the Big Ten that I'm forgetting and will remember at some point during this podcast. But I think there's you did lose Joey Hauser. There's some production there and some leadership and veteran type vibes that need to be replaced there. So that's the other part of it too, is that this was not a great basketball team last year. And so with that being said, unless the freshmen are just unbelievable, that everybody has to take a step forward for Michigan State to realize their full potential.
And not only was it not a great team, I would also say it was an inconsistent one, which makes this even more interesting, right? Because you saw what they did against Kansas State. Now, they couldn't stop Kansas State, but Kansas State also couldn't stop them, right? They have these games where you feel like they can play with anybody in the country, but they don't. Last season, they didn't show up that way. And I feel like this has been the last couple seasons for Michigan State, where on the right day, they look brilliant, and then they also leave you scratching your head about what just happened sometimes. You're not winning the Big Ten with that kind of DNA, especially when Zach Edey is sitting there in West Lafayette with a chip on his shoulder now after what happened. You got to be way more consistent and show up every night. Yeah, that's one of the big questions for me. I figured you were going to bring that up because you're a big believer in that. It's kind of weird because, they weren't all that far from making the Final Four, but also they had to beat Marquette, Big East regular season and conference tournament champions in the second round of the NCAA tournament for a reason.
Right. Exactly. The other thing I'll add on top of that, and maybe we can talk about the freshmen a little bit specifically Xavier Booker, but this team is going to be super duper athletic this year, especially if Booker and Carr are important parts of the rotation, and Carr is the bigger question mark there in terms of what kind of role he ends up having. At least for me, I think Booker, if Michigan State is good, Booker will be a big part of that. But I think that is an important thing this year as well, that they're going to have some really disruptive athleticism, with Booker being a 6'10" center that just moves really fluidly, and he's not super big, and you'll hear everybody talk about how he needs to add 10 pounds, and he will, because everyone does. But he's got a 7'5" wingspan. He can run the floor with or without the ball in his hands. Like, he's going to be super fun to watch. I've already talked about Carr and his athleticism, but there's going to be a different level of just physical gifts on this particular Michigan State team as well.
Mm-hmm.
Anything else on Sparty and Tom Izzo? Yeah, I think this is an important season for Michigan State, because they should be good. And the last 3 years, basically since the year that they didn't get to play in the tournament, have not been good. They just haven't, and it'll be disappointing in a year but like, you could look back at each of those 3 years and you weren't really expecting Michigan State to be elite those 3 years. And I actually think it's really interesting whether or not they will be elite this year, but the foundation is there and the talent is there this year for that to be a possibility. And I think it's important that they answer the call.
I'll save my thoughts on that for later.
Okay. You're most intrigued by?
I went Illinois.
Okay.
I feel like that's just my answer every season.
That is your that might have been your answer last year, was it?
Did you go back and look? No, I did not.
That's okay. I'm only a little bit disappointed.
Okay. A lot of this has to do with last season. It was just a strange one, where you kind of kept trying to talk yourself into the fact that this was supposed to be a really, really good basketball team, and then it just wasn't.
Mm-hmm.
So you got Terrence Shannon and Coleman Hawkins back. So that's a really good place to start. I really like Sincere Harris. Looking forward to him taking another step this season. Ty Rodgers also contributed minutes. Hopefully you get a healthy look Goody. Then you've got, Quincy Guerrier coming in from Oregon, Justin Harmon from Utah Valley, Marcus Dalmask from Southern Illinois. How much they all contribute, we'll see. Guerrier is obviously a high major experienced guy.
Mm-hmm.
There is still a lot of talent here. Maybe not win the Big Ten, compete with Purdue kind of talent, like we were talking about last season, but I just find this fascinating in terms of what went wrong last season, and can this group fix that? Because sometimes, just the pieces don't fit for whatever reason, and you move some and you bring in some new ones and it clicks, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because on paper, you look at Terrence Shannon and Coleman Hawkins, you go, that's one of the better duos in the Big Ten. That's a team that should be comfortably in the top half of the Big Ten with the supporting cast that they have. And obviously, Brad Underwood has shown he knows how to navigate this conference. They don't have quite the firepower they had last season, but is it almost an addition by subtraction thing just because it obviously didn't work the way they were hoping last season? I'm very intrigued by this roster and kind of the context with which Illinois enters this season.
I think late in the season 2 seasons ago, I said something to the effect of Coleman Hawkins could be one of the best players in the country next year, as in the 2022-23 season. And I kind of think Brad Underwood thought so too. And him not being that this year, or last year, excuse me, just kind of threw a wrench into everything. And
That is a
then,
good point. Right. You went from having an All-American to not having an All-American.
yeah, and he went. We're talking now. Granted, the jump was still substantial. I mean, we went from 5.9 in points and 4.3 rebounds 2 years ago, granted on a team that included Kofi Coburn, to 10 points, 6 rebounds. And I don't think that's the jump that anyone in Champaign thought that Coleman Hawkins was going to have. I think everyone thought it was going to be a bigger jump than that. And I say that to say that that's where Illinois' ceiling will come this year, is how good he is. You know how good Terrence Shannon Jr. is and will be. That's one of the two guys from the all Big Ten first team last year returning to college basketball this season. So you know what you're going to get from him. But like you said, on paper, that looks like one of the best duos in the Big Ten. And on paper, it looked like that last year too. And it just wasn't. And with the lack of continuity, right? If anything else, the things that you lose from from seeing guys enter the transfer portal, even if you're not that upset about guys like RJ Melendez and guys like Sky Clark and Jaden Epps, maybe Jaden Epps hurts a little bit more than those other two, but you lose continuity. And the thing you need to be able to lean back on in Champaign this year is how good Terrence Shannon Jr. and Coleman Hawkins are together. And if they're not, it's just going to be kind of a forgettable. They'll still be a team, I think, that has enough talent to make the NCAA tournament, be in the conversation for the NCAA tournament. But if you want a season that you're not going to forget about in 12 months, then it starts with those two guys, and specifically
Absolutely.
Hawkins.
Absolutely.
We're gonna go to that team. I'm intrigued by Purdue this season, and it has less to do with. I'm super intrigued by how this team is talked about all season. And that's kind of where it starts. Because a lot of the questions you might ask about a team that you're intrigued by don't really exist for Purdue. If Zach Edey is healthy, which no reason to suggest that he's not. If Zach Edey is healthy for 30 games, Purdue's going to win the Big Ten, and he's going to be the National Player of the Year. There's just nobody that can stop him. It is about as inevitable as a college basketball outcome gets, especially the National Player of the Year thing. Maybe they don't win the Big Ten, but if they don't, somebody won 16, 17 games to do it, because Purdue is going to make, if somebody else wants to win this conference, they're going to have to win a lot of games to do it. But the massive questions around this team, I'm not really sure they matter when it comes to the actual number of wins and losses they have this year. And the big cloud around them, you can't answer that question until March. Nobody cares what Purdue does in the regular season this year. But you lose as a 1 seed in the first round. You have the unfortunate, you unfortunately play St. Peter's in the Sweet 16. So you go from we made a Sweet 16 to we lost to St. Peter's in the Sweet 16. And so nobody remembers that you went to the Sweet 16, which is fine, fair. You shouldn't have lost to St. Peter's, but I think that gets lost. That it just kind of gets grouped into a sentence of, well, they lost to North Texas 3 years ago, and then they lost to St. Peter's, and they lost to, help, who did they lose to last year? Do you remember? The point being is that those three things are not the same.
I can see the coach's name is in my face. Or the coach's face is, I don't even know what I was trying to say.
The coach's name is in my face.
Oh, goodness.
On the tip of my tongue, The
Keep
point
talking.
being is that those three things are not the same. But they are remembered the same, which might as well mean that they're the same. But I'm just, you bring back all of the same guys. Who was it?
FDU.
Thank you. The Farley Dickinsons, the Fighting Farley Dickinsons. Um, you bring back pretty much everybody except for David Jenkins Jr. Braden Smith and Fletcher Lawyer. Ethan Morton is your backcourt depth. Mason Gillis is your kind of glue swing, could break the record for the NCAA tournament, for college basketball threes in one game guy randomly out of absolutely nowhere. And then Trey Kaufman, Ren, and Caleb First are kind of your front court depth. But that's kind of it. You add Miles Colvin in recruiting, but we'll see how big of a impact he makes in year one. And then you get Lance Jones as a transfer, which I don't think is unimportant, but is not the most impactful transfer of the college basketball season. And I put whoever you want around Zach Edey. That's just kind of where I am with this basketball team. And all of these questions about how this team improves around Zach Edey, I don't really care about the answers to them until March. And I don't think anybody else cares about the answers to them until March. So I'm just intrigued by, does anyone consider, how long does Purdue have to be the number one team in the country before someone considers them elite? Is it just have to be awkward before people accept and admit it and call that basketball team elite, or will they never do that? These are all of my ponderings. It has less to do with the actual basketball team and more to do with their place in the basketball ecosystem this coming season.
Yeah. I look at this and I say this, outside of just the improvement you hope that specifically the guards make from year one to year two, just on paper, this is a more talented basketball team than last year's.
Yeah.
Without anybody even doing anything better. Because of what you brought in and what you lost. Again, kind of periphery pieces, not going to make a super big impact, but that's a top 60 recruit you're bringing in, and you go, I don't really know what kind of role he's going to play because I don't know what kind of room there is for him because of all of these other guys.
Right.
And I am right there with you, and that was part of my thing about this is I feel like last season we kind of went in ebbs and flows with Purdue, where it was, oh my goodness, these dudes are just unbeatable, right? Coming out of Thanksgiving and what they did and just, oh, this is clearly the best team in the country. And then they just kept going for a little while, steamrolled some people in non-conference, and then they lost a couple Big Ten games. And then it was, oh, maybe these guys aren't that good. Clearly Zach Edey is, but this team hasn't really figured it out yet. And then they kind of just went along, did what they needed to do in the Big Ten. And then it was kind of, oh, well, maybe we got to start talking about Purdue finding a way to win the national championship again. And then, obviously, the first round game against Farley Dickinson happened. So even last season, we couldn't decide how good this team actually was. Generally speaking, that's not you, because I think you were pretty consistent on your beliefs about this team. But to your point about this season, okay, if they just start steamrolling people again and they get to number one, are they just going to stay there? And are we going to treat them like a national title favorite then? It's a very interesting conversation because there are clear flaws that need to be addressed. But I'm with you that even if, so for example, they were 276th in three-point shooting, which was essentially what happened in that game, right? Is they just took a bunch of good threes and they couldn't hit them.
Which would really be like if they didn't have the gravitational pull of Zach Edey, you might as well be 325th in 3-point shooting.
Right.
Because you just get better looks than everybody else because of Zach Edey.
Right. It becomes even more important because of the way this team is built. Yeah. So if all of a sudden Lawyer and Smith come back as better 3-point shooters, that's something that you and I are going to discuss on the podcast. But I'm with you. Does it even matter until March? because we can sit here and say, look, this team is better equipped from a personnel and skill set standpoint to complement Zach Edey and to be able to overcome something going wrong, aka a bad shooting night. But and there's also the Matt Painter context of, hasn't quite gotten to that level with these teams, but also it's Purdue, and we're, criticizing Purdue for not winning national championships, which is a incredible thought in and of itself. It is going to be, this is also something I'm really curious about, is just how do we talk about this team all season? Because I'm with you that especially because you saw what Edey did last year, there's just nothing that's going to be surprising in the regular season unless they're bad. And I just don't see them being bad.
I just like, if they're gonna go 14-2 to start the season, they'll go 14-2 whether Braden Smith and Fletcher Lawyer shoot better or not. Right?
Yeah.
And I'm still truly baffled that they lost that basketball game, because it's not like those guys shot the lights out all season and then, I mean, they won the Big Ten regular season, and those guys didn't shoot that well in the Big Ten, especially in the back half of it. So I'm truly baffled that they lost that basketball game. But yeah, all of those things that you pointed out, I'm in lockstep with. The shooting has to be better. Braden Smith, 37.6%, was easily the best 3-point shooter on this team from a percentage perspective, even though Fletcher Lawyer is the most important 3-point shooter on this basketball team. At least for my money, he is. 32.6% from the 3-point line is where Fletcher Lawyer ended up last season. That has to be better. That athleticism question mark, when this team sees a super athletic backcourt that can bother Braden Smith and Fletcher Lawyer, do they get better at handling that this season? And the last thing I'll say is, if there's a year to believe in development from year over year being as substantial as possible, it's probably freshman to sophomore year. So it's reasonable to suggest that just by default, this team is going to be better than it was last year.
Yep.
And I think it's okay to accept that and believe that in the regular season and still be skeptical about how much it actually matters. And we'll only be able to have that question answered when we get to March. So super fascinated by Purdue this season. You got anything else on the Boilers, on the Fighting Matt Painters?
It goes into my first storyline, so you want me to just jump in?
Let's do it.
All right. My first one is just simply, is somebody a national title contender? Because on paper, obviously, Purdue is. But as we've just talked about, I still feel like even at the end of last season, they were one of those teams that was kind of, well, I could see it, but I'm not so sure anymore. It was never a clear cut, this is one of the favorites. The way that we were talking about them at the beginning of the season. And so a lot of this was the conversation we just had about how do we view Purdue from start to finish. And then, does Michigan State emerge into this conversation? I have my questions, and I know you do too. I'm not putting them there by default. But that is going to be a storyline with this conference until somebody finally wins another national championship. There's always really good teams that seem to come up just a little bit short, whether that's getting knocked out earlier, whether that's making the Final Four and not the national championship game, losing in the national championship game, right? We've seen just every combination of this at this point. Can somebody or 2-3 teams in a season where I feel like there are a lot of kind of question marks and not a bunch of clear cut, these are the teams to beat, can the Big Ten and specifically Purdue kind of take control of that? And we're going into March saying somebody's got to find a way to stop those guys, because from a talent development, talent returning continuity, Matt Painter standpoint, it's entirely possible that we get to that where Purdue is just clearly the best team in the country during the regular season.
I have this same storyline kind of from like 10 degrees to the left or right. Is there an elite team in this conference, whether it's in reality or just perception?
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm not sure anybody is going to be willing to describe Purdue as elite this year.
Mm-hmm.
Unless it's just awkward that we're not, because
Right.
they're 18-0.
Yeah.
I think Michigan State has a chance to be that. I think I will predict now that no matter how, like, if Michigan State is good, it doesn't matter how good Purdue is, that Michigan State will be considered the better national championship pick out of the Big Ten when we get to March. I don't see a world in which, unless Purdue is 30-0, 29-1, where that's not, where people actually will consider Purdue the better national championship pick over Michigan State, assuming that Michigan State has a, top 10, top 12
comparable season,
type of season.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I could already see the arguments being laid out.
Oh yeah. Because this conference has turned into not a conference that pumps out elite basketball teams every year. It's a conference that's just so difficult to play in because teams, 2 through 11 finish 12-8, between 12-8 and 10-10.
And there are 10 teams sniffing around the NCAA tournament the entire season. Yeah,
exactly. And that's interesting. Maybe that's kind of how it's always been, but when you pivot from, you had the Wisconsin teams in the middle of the 2010s, you had the Michigan teams in the early 2010s. Michigan State always has an elite team in there every 3, 4, 5 years. Illinois in the middle of the 2000s. Your Ohio
the Illinois
State
team that everybody picked to win the national championship. Don't forget about them.
The Illinois team that everyone picked to win the national championship. Your Ohio State teams in the late 2000s, early 2010s. You just don't really have a team outside of Purdue that's in that moment right now. And as a result, and a byproduct of how people feel about Purdue right now is this question of, is there a team in the Big Ten this year that looks elite and feels elite from a perception perspective? Because I'm not totally sure that it is, because Purdue's not going to, no one's going to give Purdue the benefit of the doubt this year.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
The other thing I have is kind of on the flip side of that is, who's the third best team in this conference? There are contenders, but when you look back at the way this conference shook out last year, when you look at the conference standings from a season ago, it was Purdue at 15-5. They won the conference by 3 games. And then Indiana in second and Rutgers in 9th. T9, so 10th, were separated by 2 games. Mm-hmm. Indiana was 12-8. Rutgers was 10-10. You have a couple teams in there that don't have. So let's just go through it, right? Northwestern, Indiana, those 2 teams finished 12-8. Indiana is trying to replace Trace Jackson Davis, which we can talk about Indiana further if you'd like to, but there's some pieces coming back. There's a 5-star, a bona fide 5-star, and Mackenzie Mgbako. I'm going to get that wrong all year. And you get Kelly Ware from Oregon, but I don't think anyone actually understands, like me included, how difficult, and Mike Woodson, until he actually has to do it in a real basketball game, is how difficult. I mean, everything that Indiana did for 4 years, 5 years, included Trace Jackson
Four.
Davis.
I
Did he
think it was
play
4.
4? Did he actually play 4? He didn't play 5. Okay.
I think it was 4.
Trace Jackson Davis was at the center of literally every single thing that they did. So Indiana is right potentially, but you know how I feel about Indiana, and I feel even, and it wasn't just Trace Jackson Davis that they lost, right? You lose Jalen Hood-Schifino, and your kind of veteran leadership guy in Miller Kopp as well. Northwestern, Boo Buie is back for like the 14th year. But you don't get Chase Audige back, which is significant. Those were the guys for Northwestern last year, and it's not like Northwestern is reloading in a way that losing Audige isn't super significant. Wisconsin, steady floor, brings back top 4 scorers, but that's a team that finished 9-11 in the Big Ten last year. So how much better does that team get? Ohio State gets Bruce Thornton and Zed Key back, along with Jamison Battle, a newcomer from Minnesota, but they sucked last year. If they're going to be good, they have a really nice recruiting class this year, but what can Chris Holtmann do with a team that is basically brand spanking new outside of Bruce Thornton and Zed Key? Jameer Young should be better than he was last year at Maryland, but Maryland also kind of went up and down in the what are we adding, what are we losing kind of game. And we talked about Illinois as well. So when it comes to it's a twofold question, right? Who is the third best team in this conference? Maybe there's not a third best team in this conference. Maybe there's 6 third best teams in this conference. And does anybody emerge as a I would probably go right tier 1 Purdue, tier 2 or 1B Michigan State, maybe tier 2 just out of respect to Purdue. And then that tier 3, how close is that tier 3 to Michigan State? If Michigan State is in that tier 1, is there any team anywhere close in the vicinity as that third best team in the conference? All of these things. Or is it just going to kind of be similar to the way this conference was structured last year, where maybe instead of one team pushing 15, 16 wins, there's 2 in Michigan State and Purdue, and then you have 7 teams with somewhere between 12 and 10 wins, and then add another 2 teams that have somewhere between, if you want to go between 12 and 9 wins. I'm curious. That's kind of the makeup of this conference, is how much of a bloodbath it is for most of the teams and how difficult it is to get to double-digit wins. We'll see if that's the case this year.
My second storyline is very similar. Just how do the tiers break down here? You talked about the top. I'm specifically focused on the middle, because basically it was just a jumbled mess where outside of the very top and the very bottom, everyone won between 9 and 11 games. Sorry, 9 and 12 games. I think it was 11 teams, if I did counting correctly. One between 9 and 12 games. So
in Purdue at 15, and Ohio State and Minnesota had 5 and 2. So other than that, it was between 12 and 9.
Right. I see this more of as a top half of the conference, bottom half of the conference situation this season. I feel like there are going to be some more clear delineations there. Who ends up actually being on either side of that, I'm not entirely sure. There are a lot of question marks that we'll get to here. But having, for example, Penn State have the season they had last season, where they were clearly one of the top, 7, 8 teams in the Big Ten, if not even better than that. That's not a team you're expecting to be there. And so it just kind of messes with the overall traditional makeup, and not having that second team also allowed all these teams to get 10, 11, 12 wins, right? Where if Michigan State wins 14, 15 games and Purdue wins 16, mathematically, you're just not going to have that same kind of situation. So do we get another jumbled mess, or do we get at least a little bit more clarity where there's at least a group of teams that are either excusing themselves from the NCAA tournament conversation. It's not 2, it's 5, or a group of teams where they're just more comfortable about the NCAA tournament because they've got 13, a good non-conference with 12 wins or 13 conference wins or something like that, where you clearly feel like they're a step above everybody else, where last season it just felt like everybody was about equal outside of Purdue.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. 8 teams in the tournament last year, but probably 4 of those were curious about their NCAA tournament standing in the last 2 weeks of the season, something like that, right? And maybe it ends up being 8 teams, but there were like 7 that really felt good, or there were 6 that really felt good, and there were a couple on the bubble. But there, lots of teams were in that, 20 and 21 and 16, 21 and 13 to 23 and 14 kind of space last season.
Mm-hmm.
Outside of Zach Edey and Terrence Shannon Jr., who's the third best player in this conference? Who makes up the top? Who makes up first team All Big Ten this year? And there are some options, right? Boo Booey's coming back. You have to think he's in the conversation. You have some freshmen coming in that could be in the conversation. But when you look at who departed, after the season ended, I mean, right, your first team was Zach Edey, Trace Jackson Davis, Terrence Shannon Jr., Chris Murray, and Jalen Pickett. 3 of those guys are gone. You'd have to think that Zach Edey and Terrence Shannon Jr. will be right there. But then you look on the second team, Hunter Dickinson, no longer a member of the Big Ten. Tyson Walker was there. Chase Audije was there, which we've already talked about. On that third team, actually, is the one that really got cleaned out. Apart from Clifford Amori, help me. Amori. I apologize, Clifford. Clifford Amori is back at Rutgers, but Jet Howard's gone. Jalen Hood-Schifino is gone. Kobe Buffkin is gone, and Matthew Mayer is gone. Who steps up? Who is the third, fourth, fifth, and fifth best players in this conference this year? I've got nothing else to make it more complicated than that.
The 2 guys that came to mind for me were Tyson Walker and Cliff Amori. Outside of the 2 first team returners. But does Tyson Walker actually get his numbers to a point where he's more than second team?
Mm-hmm.
Even if he performs like it, just because of the help he has around him. Right? That team is theoretically so well balanced that does he stand out enough? Whereas you look at Cliff Amori is going to be the guy at Rutgers. So maybe that's my answer. This dude's just putting up numbers that are going to get him on the first team. I'll go with Amori.
Yeah, I think the short answer there is probably Amori, Tyson Walker, and Boo Booey. Those are probably the 3. Mm-hmm. The other guy on your second team last year that also left after the season ended was Derek Walker, the Nebraska forward, who was a 5th-year senior and therefore had exhausted his eligibility. But there are a lot of guys that said sayonara. When you look at some of the, maybe Bruce Thornton at Ohio State, especially if Ohio State's a little better this year, they had a really, really rough non-conference. But, even maybe Connor Esigian from Wisconsin, he was part of the Big Ten All-Freshman team. Braden Smith, Fletcher Lawyer, Jameer Young was a second team.
Just throwing it out there.
Yeah. So there were a lot of that all Big Ten team I'd put up against any other all conference team. And I'm not totally sure I'll feel that way, apart from the fact that Zach Edey will be on the team. So maybe I would, but outside of that, how impressive will the first team All Big Ten team be this year? Maybe that's the best way to put it, because
Yeah.
Trace Jackson Davis and Zach Edey are two of the 5 best big men in college basketball of the last since 2015.
Yeah.
Terrence Shannon
Certainly
Jr.
not,
is
certainly not an
spectacular.
outrageous thing to say.
Chris Murray, NBA draft pick. Jalen Pickett, NBA draft pick. All those guys, spectacular. And we'll see if that's the case this year. I mean, it will be the case, but relative to the rest of the country.
You ready for my final one?
Hit me.
My final storyline is just, this is a big season for programs in the Big Ten. Let me just run down these real quickly, and I'll see if you have anything else to add once I'm done.
Sure.
Purdue, you get one more shot with Zach Edey. Enough said. Michigan State, will Tom Izzo, in his however many years he has left in Michigan State, have a team this talented again? And can he and his anti-portal sensibilities build a national title contender in today's day and age? Can this, right? Because if this team isn't elite, it's, to me, fair to wonder if Izzo's going to get another elite team doing this the way he is doing it.
If this team isn't elite, he's going to retire after this year is over.
Okay.
Because he's going to do the Roy Williams. Because Tom Izzo is many things, and on that list is an old man complaining about how things work in college basketball right now. And
certainly does have some of that in him, yes.
And if they're not good, if they're not really good, he's going to retire. There you go. And I got the receipts now, because he's going to be fed up with it.
Continuing on our list, Indiana in a post-Trace Jackson Davis world. You talked about this. Can Mike Woodson keep this thing going? On paper, it looks promising, right? They've got talent. It's not like the wheels are falling off, but also, can this team continue to win at that level without Trace Jackson Davis? Just how important was he? Maryland.
And Baco might be the best 3-point shooter in Bloomington since like James Blackman, like a decade ago. He's sick. He's going to be awesome.
Kevin Willard in year 2 at Maryland overachieved the last season, did a great job.
Mm-hmm.
You know, most of that team, 3 of your top 4 scorers, Jameer Young, Julian Reese, Dante Scott, are back. You've got a top 30 recruit in Deshaun Harris-Smith. There's talent there. Mm-hmm. But now people are very much aware of what Maryland can do. And, you know, the wheels kind of fell off after their great start last season, but that was still a good basketball team. Now they're not catching anybody by surprise. Illinois. What happens? We talked about this after last year's debacle, if you want to use that strong of a word to describe it. Can they continue to cement themselves to the top of the conference the way they have the past 5 or so seasons? Rutgers, you know, this was a team that you just felt like was always going to find a way to get into the NCAA tournament. And now you've lost another set of important pieces. Yes, Cliff Amore is back, as we talked about. It's him and Andre Hyatt that you have coming back as your key guys. You know, you've got some accomplished mid-major transfers, but the talent doesn't jump off the page at you. Wisconsin, right?
Yeah, Pikel and the Rack are going to have their hands full this year.
Yeah,
trying to get that team to the tournament.
Yeah.
Maryland went undefeated in conference play at home last year.
There you go.
The only game they lost at home last year was UCLA on December 14th. Was
that the game they couldn't score in?
Yeah, they lost 87-60. They got smoked.
Oh, maybe I was thinking of a different one. It doesn't seem as extreme. I thought there was a game where they scored 42 points or something. Maybe I'm making that up.
I think you might be right. They lost. Keep talking. I'm looking. They lost to Tennessee on a neutral in 56-53.
That might have been the game.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
That game was played. That game was played at the Barclays Center in Brooklyn.
Oh, okay. Yes, I do think it was that one. You know, Wisconsin, we talked about there's a lot of talent returning there, but not a particularly inspiring team last season. Mm-hmm. Can Wisconsin get back to where you expect Wisconsin to be? Shout out to Nebraska. 500 overall, 9 Big Ten wins. Big big step forward for Fred Hoiberg. Can they, follow it up with another decent season? And then you get to the two potentially most interesting out of all of this: Juwan Howard and Chris Holtmann.
Yeah. Market, that's 58 minutes before we talked about Michigan.
Yeah. Massive seasons from right. So a lot of this doesn't necessarily have to do with the coaches. Steve Peichel has earned himself plenty of leash at Rutgers for what he's done.
Yeah.
But these are the two coaches I'm specifically looking at in terms of what Ohio State had going on last season, where I loved that team on paper and they were just not good. Michigan, there's been a lot going on. Doug McDaniel and his 8.6 points per game are your leading returning scorer. Now you're adding Olivier Kamwa, Trey Jackson, and Namari Burnett, and hopefully a healthy Jalen Llewellyn. So it's not like there's a talent issue there necessarily, but
there wasn't one last year that you had Hunter Dickinson
right.
and 2 first-round picks on that basketball team.
Exactly.
And you missed the tournament.
Right. It just hasn't been working for Juwan Howard. And then Holtmann also, he was brought in to elevate Ohio State. And generally speaking, that hasn't happened.
Yeah, so, it's interesting what has happened to Holtmann, right? It went from, I mean, he turned several Butler teams into much better teams than they were supposed to be.
Yep.
And then he went to Ohio State and gets the recruits. He recruits like the Ohio State men's basketball coach should recruit.
And they were a 2 seed his first or second season with Keita Bates-Diop, right?
Yeah.
And they lost in the first round to Oral Roberts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then they had that year with no, Oral Roberts was the COVID year.
Right.
With EJ Liddell.
That's okay. It wasn't it wasn't Keita Bates-Diop. It was EJ Liddell. That's what I was thinking of. Thank you.
Yeah. But it's kind of the other way around, right? They had this super talented team last year, and for whatever reason, it just never worked. And he's in a place now in 2023 where I didn't think he would be. Now, granted, he's been there for a long time at this point. It's been 6 years. But it's kind of a commentary on how forgettable his time there has been, that you kind of look up and think, wow, Holtmann's been at Ohio State for 6 years. There isn't a ton to show for it.
Right. Especially NCAA tournament wise. Right. There have been some good teams, and specifically that one team. But, right. Because that was the season we were talking about, the best team in the country. Because it was between them and Michigan for a while.
Yeah.
That
was the
But then, right.
year.
Right. But then they don't win an NCAA tournament game. They just haven't been a factor in March.
Yeah.
So that was a lot. Feel free to respond how you would like. But that's, to me, the big story of the Big Ten this season, outside of Zach Edey, is there's a lot going on here in a lot of different ways for a lot of different programs.
Are you ready for my hot-ish take?
Sure.
I think Juwan Howard's a little Kevin Ollie-ish. Would you like me to expand? Do you get where I'm getting at? Where we looked up at the end of Kevin Ollie's tenure at UConn and realized that all of his success was the residual ink left from Calhoun.
Mm-hmm.
Jim Calhoun? John Calhoun?
Yes.
Jim Calhoun. Mm-hmm. Jim, John, Joe. They're all basically the same. Jim Calhoun. And I think what happened, right, because you had Howard took over this program in 2019-20. They went 19-12, 10-10 in the Big Ten after the final Beeline team went 30-7. That was the Brasdakis, Jordan Poole, Charles Matthews, John Teskey, Xavier Simpson, team. Isaiah Livers, Eli Brooks. Oh my gosh.
That was a really good team.
You know who was also on that team? Colin Castleton.
That's right. Yep.
How about that? Great basketball team. And a basketball team that lost in Sweet 16 to a Texas Tech team that went to the national championship game. Then he went 19-12 in his first year, which is respectable. That was a team that had Xavier Simpson, John Teskey, Eli Brooks, Franz Wagner as a freshman, Isaiah Livers, right? That was kind of the nucleus of that team. David DeJulius was on that team. And then we had what happened in 2020 and 21, which was this combination of, you brought some interesting pieces in, right? Mike Smith came as a transfer. Hunter Dickinson was a freshman on that team. Franz Wagner was awesome. Isaiah Livers was awesome. Eli Brooks was awesome. Chandi Brown was good. And what I think happened is we decided that was all Juwan Howard's doing. I think that was kind of the consensus, which I think was fair at the time, because he came in, kind of figured it out in his first year, and then he had this really awesome team that started. That was the year that they started, it was like, oh my gosh, like Gonzaga is undefeated, Baylor's really awesome, and like Michigan is undefeated out of absolutely nowhere.
Was it Maui?
Yeah,
they won
maybe
one of those things. I think they won one of those Thanksgiving tournaments.
Yeah, they were
Battle for Atlantis?
Maybe so. Let's see. Maybe it was. I'm not sure. Anyways, the point being is that I'm not totally sure we gave the guys who were seniors on that team and the guy and like Franz Wagner, I'm not sure we gave those guys enough credit for what they turned that team into. And it's not that Juwan Howard doesn't get credit for that. I'm not totally sure the culture of that program had as much to do with Juwan Howard as maybe we thought it did in the moment. Yep. And as we've gotten further away from that, it's been a little disappointing. And like that team last year missing the tournament is unacceptable. And they did. And so to your point, that's a really long-winded way of saying I think it's an absolutely a very important year for Juwan Howard. Maybe not in a does he want a job next year way. He's probably gotten a little more. He's probably got a little bit more run than that just because of who he is. I think Chris Holtman is the one that's more in the you need your basketball team to put wins on the board because your job might be at stake. I think no matter what, Juwan Howard's probably the coach of Michigan in the 2024-25 season. But in terms of the the brownie points he has with the administration at Michigan, that this is an important year for it.
And I'll bring this up too, and I'm sure you're going to bring it up with Kansas. But the other thing I was thinking about as you were laying out those teams and the key pieces, there are two consistent things that carried over past that team that was so good. The coach and Hunter Dickinson.
Mm-hmm.
Correlation doesn't equal causation, I know. But I'm right there with you that those guys, and I think Livers and Brooks, if I'm not mistaken, both got the extra COVID year. I think that's why they were still there. Not that it's super important, but I think they were fifth-year guys.
I think you're right.
Or at least one of them, maybe Livers wasn't. I don't remember. But right, having been around 3, 4, maybe even,
I feel like they would have been there the 2 years ago as well if they weren't fifth-year guys. I don't see a ton of reason for Isaiah Livers and Eli Brooks to have left if they had a COVID year.
I think Livers left to go to the NBA maybe. I don't remember. The point being that, right, they've been around. They had experienced plenty of success within that program, whether it was 3 years, 4 years, whatever. That stuff really matters, and those guys had gotten to become really, really good college players.
Yeah. We'll see. I'll believe me. I'll bring up the fact that the more important that Hunter Dickinson becomes on a basketball team, the worse that basketball team gets. Even if he was the leading scorer on that 23-5 team, even if that was the case. Anything else in storylines?
No.
Teams that can make the NCAA tournament. Let's play the game. How many do you have?
10.
Man, this is so boring. I have 10 too. Okay. Purdue. Sure.
Yeah.
Michigan State. Let's hope.
Yep.
Illinois.
Yep.
Indiana.
Yep.
Maryland.
Yep.
Ohio State.
Yep.
Wisconsin.
Yep.
Michigan.
Yep.
Rutgers.
No.
No. Do you have
No.
Northwestern?
Yes.
Okay. So which team do you have that I don't? You have Nebraska, don't you? Because you're a Fred
No.
Hoiberg lover.
I don't have Nebraska. If I'm not putting Rutgers in there, I'm not putting Nebraska in there.
Do you have Penn State in there?
No.
Okay.
No, we're gonna talk about them. Don't worry. No, the other team I have in there is Iowa.
Okay. All right. I'm fine with that.
You got, Tony Perkins, Patrick McCaffrey back. Now you have both Sanford brothers, who are some of the best recruits in Iowa history, for whatever that means. Peyton Sanford had a good season. Now Price Sanford is coming. Ben Krikke averaged 19-6 at Valparaiso. This is a team that just usually finds a way to make the NCAA tournament.
I like that pickup. That's a good pickup.
Yeah, they've still got, it's, again, you don't have a Murray brother at this point, so do you have a guy who's going to go get you 20 a game? Maybe not. But there's still enough there that, again, they're not necessarily in that top half of the conference that I feel really good about. Because to me, there's a clear kind of delineation when you're talking about Purdue, Michigan State, Maryland, Indiana, Illinois, maybe Northwestern gets in there, maybe Wisconsin gets in there. There are just teams I feel a lot better about, but from that 7 to 10 range, I'm throwing Iowa in there. And Rutgers would be my other team. So those would be my 11.
Sure.
And then the other 3 I don't feel good about at all. But my thinking with Rutgers was very simply, if last year's team didn't make it, I don't see this one making it.
Sure.
And I totally see why you would put them in there as a possibility. I just didn't want to go to 11, and I felt better about Iowa.
Yeah, I just think that Steve Peichel and an underappreciated Rutgers team is something I'd rather bet on than Iowa without Luka Garza, Chris Murray, or Keegan Murray. Having one of the 5 best offenses in the country is really easy when you have one of the 5 best offensive players in the country, or the best offensive player in the country. So I just think it's different at Iowa this year, and I don't think they're going to be good enough offensively for the fact that they just choose to consider defense optional. So that's kind of they're going to lean on something that is just not going to be good enough this year, and as a result, they're not going to be good. That's kind of my vibe on Iowa this year.
I had a hard time kind of going and deciding what to do with them and Rutgers. To me, those are going to be your bubble teams.
Yeah, I agree. Do you want to do winner first, or do you want to knock out some of the things? Have we talked about all 14 teams?
Not. I don't think we've talked. I mean, we've mentioned almost all of them at this point. Let's do winner first, though.
Okay. The winner of this conference, like it's inaccurate to pick anybody other than Purdue. It's just silly. There are plenty of questions about the Purdue Boilermakers this year. None of them are, do they have the ability to win this conference? None of them are the Duke equivalent, which is, does it, even when they're the most talented team in this conference, will they stop messing around and actually win enough games to win the regular season? None of those questions are the ones that we have about Purdue. And to circle back to something I said at the beginning of the pod, when we were talking about Purdue, all of the, I hope X happens this year, all of those things are in the context of the NCAA tournament. I hope Braden Smith and Fletcher Lawyer are better this year. That's the context of the NCAA tournament. I hope that the 3-point shooting around Zach Edey is better this year. That's in the context of the NCAA tournament. When you're in the middle of the season and you've got 2.5 days to prepare for Zach Edey and not a week because you saw that you're going to play him on Selection Sunday and you don't play him until Friday, in the grind in the middle of the year in the Big Ten, where every game is freaking impossible and you got to go up against Zach Edey. That's where he's an absolute, he's impossible to deal with. There's they're going to win 15, 16 games in the conference this year, and they're going to make somebody come after them if somebody else wants to win this conference. But all of the questions, I don't think any of them have to do with, is Purdue good enough to win the Big Ten?
They were 330th in defensive turnover percentage. Lots of
I saw
area
that.
for improvement there.
There you go.
That's about all I have to add.
I love that. Josh went over to the KenPom page while I was talking and looked for the
Oh
reddest
no, I had that
box
prepared ahead of time.
and went for the
Oh,
and looked
no.
for the reddest box.
I was ready with that factoid.
I figured you would be. Steal percentage was right there, lagging just behind at 320. But yeah, I think it will be. I think there's only one other team that's even equipped to chase Purdue.
Yep.
And maybe they'll make it close-ish, but I think it's going to be really hard for someone to win more games than Purdue in conference this year.
I could see a world in which it's a shared title.
Sure, I could see it.
Yeah, I agree with the statement though that it is. I just have a hard time believing somebody is going to win more games than Purdue.
Yeah.
You can talk me into at least as many, but that's it.
Okay, and I think it would have to be a weird year for Purdue. And so, like, if things go well at Purdue and Edie is as good as he's supposed to be, I'm not sure that even, like, Michigan State will have to be better than even an optimistic Michigan State fan would think that they're going to be, I think, to track them down if things go well.
The other thing about Edie, too, is that it's just hard for things to go wrong for him.
Right.
What he does is just so built on him just being him.
Yeah.
You know?
and it's just elevated by the fact that he's an actually good basketball player now, right? When he got to Purdue, it was, we have this incredibly high floor because you're massive. Let's turn you into a good basketball player. And I get frustrated when people suggest that Edie's dominance is only a result of his size. Like, they'll use his size as a way to dock him in the way that they'll use size as a way to elevate other players. But listen, if when Travion Williams was at Purdue, if Matt Painter thought that Zach Edey could be what Zach Edey was last year, 2 years ago, then they wouldn't have split the floor the way that they did. Travion Williams wouldn't have played as much as he did. He just wouldn't have. Matt Painter's a better and more intelligent coach than that, if he actually thought that was possible.
And Matt Painter's also not interested in easing his players' egos.
Right. 100%. And he was very adamant about that there were some things about his game that he always had, like his endurance. People always wanted to talk about, man, he's playing 26 minutes a game. It's like, yeah, he could have done that last year too. He just didn't need him to. But if he was showing that in practice 2 years ago, he'd have played more than he did 2 years ago. So there's my Zach Edey rant. Any final nuggets?
Oh yes, let's make sure we touch on everybody here.
Let's do it.
Minnesota, Dawson Garcia back. Second, third leading scorers not back. You got a top 100 recruit in Cameron Christie. Some transfers, Elijah Howard, Mike Mitchell Jr. from mid-major schools that put up numbers. Plenty of opportunity for them to put up numbers at Minnesota as well. Don't feel great about their chances. Penn State is interesting at the least. I mean, if you're Mike Rhodes, you could do worse than basically completely starting over with Ace Baldwin, Qudus Wahab, and two players from North Carolina, and DeMarco Dunn and Puff Johnson. Again, there are reasons DeMarco Dunn and Puff Johnson are no longer at North Carolina, but
Puff Johnson at least almost came to Butler. How about that?
Mm-hmm.
Butler was a finalist for him.
Yeah, there is something here. It's not like the cupboard is completely bare. I just think this is going to take some time, and I don't think people are going to quite appreciate just how good of a job Micah Shrewsbury did. Also want to give a shout out to my guy Bragi Goodmanson, the Icelander.
Sure.
Very much looking forward to him this season. Hope he sees the floor. I don't know if he's expected to. I will be paying attention though. Rooting hard for him if he does. And yeah, Nebraska, interesting kind of collection of players here. You lost 2 of your 3 main scorers. You have an intriguing group of transfers. A couple all-conference guys at the mid-major level. Aaron Eulis, Tyler's brother, from Iowa. Can they continue the momentum of last season? I don't see it in a completely upward trajectory. So yeah, I don't see him in the NCAA tournament conversation, but I think we've now touched on everybody.
Yeah, the last thing I'll add is, you know how annoyed the Minnesota men's basketball program must be that it took Dawson Garcia 3 years to get back to Minnesota? Minnesota kid, recruited by Minnesota, and it took him going to 2 different schools before he came back to Minnesota. I'm not saying that the trajectory of Minnesota's basketball program would be different if he had just committed there as a freshman, but it might. You know, like I
think about him. So would that have been?
So that would have been 2 years ago.
So Marcus Carr's final season, right?
I believe so. Minnesota, so it would have been the 2020-21 college basketball season. Would have been his first year. That would have been Richard Pitino, Marcus Carr, Liam Robbins, Brandon Johnson.
Oh, I would have loved that team. Oh, that team would have been good. I mean, that team was still pretty good.
Bothgok, heck yeah.
Yeah.
Gabe Kelscher was there. That would have been a good basketball team.
That's one of my... I love that. Just the players. That's one of my all-time favorite teams in terms of players.
Now, I won't get too ahead of myself. They were 14 and 15, and it's not like Dawson Garcia was Zion Williamson. But
yeah, they were a competent basketball team at least.
But all of that to say, it would have been like maybe they would have had a really solid season in there if he had shown up at that point. Maybe Marcus Carr doesn't transfer if they do have a solid season. All of these things. I just think that's interesting.
Yeah.
But hopefully it sounds like he found a place where he gets to be the basketball player that he wants to be, and it's much, much closer to home. So good for him. Anything else on the Big Ten?
I think we've discussed it enough.
I think you're right.
Sayonara to this version.
Sayonara.
Get ready for the chaos of 2024-25.
Gosh. I could talk for an hour about how much I hate conference realignment. An hour, easily. But that we can save that. We could save that for a different day. An hour and 20 minutes. My goodness. This is what happens when you have 14. Like, how long is it going to be next year? 4.5 hours? We'll see.
As we talk about, right, so 2 of the most interesting programs currently in the Pac-12. At least 2 of them, at least 2. Plus, yeah, the Big Ten.
Whatever. We'll be back next week. Big 12. I don't know who's in that conference. I'll find out in the next 7 days, I assure you. And I'll report back to you. We get to
talk about the new teams. It's exciting.
I'll report back to you which teams are in the conference. It's a mystery, and I'm on the case. And we'll come talk about it on a Monday, 7 days from now. Please subscribe to the Jays for Days podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. Follow us on Twitter at Jays for Days Pod. And we'll be back next week. Thank you so much for listening to this edition of the Jays for Days podcast. I'm Josh. He is also Josh. And we will see you later.